Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for today's program. My name is Raymond Karam. I'm the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. We're truly delighted to be hosting the book launch of the book Urban Modernity in the Contemporary Gulf, looking at architectural production in the modernization era in the Arabian Peninsula. We're honored to have a truly wonderful lineup of speakers today, with the book editors along with two of the chapter authors joining us for this conversation. I'll start with someone who needs no introduction in this space, but I'll introduce him anyway. Sultan Sooud al-Qassemi, a columnist and researcher on social, political, and cultural affairs in the Gulf Arab states. He is the founder of the Barjeel Art Foundation in Sharjah, the UAE, and is currently the Kuwait Foundation Visiting Scholar at the Middle East Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is also a lecturer at the School of Arts and Sciences at Brandeis University. In addition to co-editing this book, he, along with Todd Rees, is the co-editor of Building Sharjah, a wonderful book that was published earlier this year documenting modern architecture in the UAE's third largest city. Also with us is Roberto Fabbri, co-editor of this book and an architect, researcher, and associate professor at Zayed University in the UAE. He previously taught at the University of Monterrey in Mexico, the University of Bologna in Italy, and the American University of Kuwait. As a consultant with the UN Development Program, he participated in the rehabilitation of the Kuwait National Museum and completed the transformation of the American Missionary Hospital of Kuwait into a cultural hub. I'd also like to welcome Jumanah Abbas, an architect, writer, and researcher. She works through collective collaborations with institutes, regional organizations, and universities, including the Mapping Memories of Resistance, the Untold Story of the Occupation of the Golan Heights, a project in collaboration with the London School of Economics, Birzeit University, and Al-Marsad Arab Human Rights Center in the Golan Heights. She is also working on the upcoming Qatar Museum's Quadrennial Project, a multi-site exhibition opening in 2024. Last but not least is Edward Nilsson, principal of Nilsson and Siden Associates, Inc., Architects and Planners in Marblehead, Massachusetts. He's a former instructor in architectural history and case studies at Boston Architectural College, and he has guest lectured at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Salem State University, and Northeastern University. Among others, he has served as lead project architect for mixed-use development projects in Kuwait City, including residential, commercial, office, and parking facilities. We're excited to have a guest moderator today, and that is Huma Gupta, a full-time lecturer in the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture at MIT. She is currently writing her first book, The Architecture of Dispossession, which is based on her doctoral thesis. As a practitioner, she has worked on infrastructure projects in Afghanistan, municipal planning in Syria, eviction prevention, and homelessness in the greater Boston area, and humanitarian response to housing needs for persons displaced due to climate, conflict, and development projects around the world. Before we start, I'd like to mention that the open access version of this book has been made available under Creative Commons license, and I'll share the link to that in the chat. You can also purchase a hard copy of this, and the publishers have offered us a 20% discount, especially for this program, and I'll share the discount code with the chat as well. And with that, Huma, over to you.
Thank you so much, Raymond, for those wonderful introductions, and thank you all today for joining us. We have a action-packed sort of agenda for you today, and we're all coming together to celebrate the launch of this phenomenal book, which is, I think, most importantly, a labor of love, a labor of thoughtful reflection on the question of heritage in what we broadly define as the contemporary Gulf. And I think it's important to point out that the intervention that this book makes is really timely and very much needed, because we have shifted over the past few decades in the way in which we talk about heritage and cultural preservation in the broader Middle East, but especially in the Gulf. And today, the scholars that have been assembled in this book by Roberto and Sultan have actually started to really dig deep into these very, I would say sometimes even contentious and difficult questions of heritage. How do we think about al-imara al-haditha? How do we think about, contemporary architecture and modern heritage? Do we preserve it the way that we used to? Do we museumify it and create heritage villages as we used to? What do we do with the category of architecture that we define as Islamic architecture? Do we spectacularize it, as Roberto and Sultan write in the introduction, right? How do we contend with our affective feelings about the spaces that we grew up in? I myself grew up in the UAE, and some of the architecture from the 1960s and 70s, right? There's a relationship of nostalgia to that time period. And how do we contend with that? And especially in the present moment, when we are thinking about adaptive reuse and thinking about how do we retrofit some of these modern heritage buildings, we have to also think about the fact that these buildings have a lot of embodied carbon in them, and merely demolishing these buildings and building anew might not be the way forward for us in the 21st century. So there are a lot of contending visions and aspirations and complex histories that tie us from Doha to Abu Dhabi to Riyadh, and this book kind of very carefully takes us through these beautiful case studies and portals into those particular histories, and two of which we're going to hear today from Jumanah, Abbas, and Ed Nilsson, who we are extremely grateful to have today. But I encourage all of you to go and check out the open course or the open source book, because there's just so much depth here that I think even in the context of an hour today, we're not going to be able to get into. So I really think it's wonderful that the editors have made this available for all of us. And now I'd like to introduce and hand over to Ed Nilsson to discuss the way in which questions of heritage take a part and emerge in his wonderful essay for the volume. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Huma. I first want to thank the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington for hosting this event, and the book editors Roberto, Fabbri, and Sultan Sooud al-Qassemi for organizing the Gulf Research Center conference at the University of Cambridge in 2019 that led to this book. Recent years have witnessed the growth of literature and preservation studies throughout the Gulf area. These studies are driven by an interest in the identity, sense of place, and meaning of architecture. Kuwait's first master plan in 1951 included demolition of the city walls and old houses to provide land for the construction of new buildings and roads. Residents were offered incentives to relocate into new neighborhoods south of the old city in the desert. The Kuwaitis discovered belatedly that the demolition of traditional buildings was a great loss to their cultural continuity. According to historian Farah al-Nakib, in the erasure of the townspeople's close-knit traditional housing, their formerly complex and diverse everyday lives in functionally mixed and integrated urban spaces became fragmented into discrete functional zones and privatized spheres of behavior. In 1968, the city's advisory planning committee responded by soliciting design proposals from 4 internationally recognized architects and planners to guide development and restore continuity to Kuwait's urban heritage. Banfi, Belgiojoso, Perasudi, and Rogers, or PPPR, from Italy, Peter and Alison Smithson from England, Candilis, Josic, and Woods from France, and Rima and Reili Pietola from Finland were chosen to explore architectural form in a wider social Kuwaiti context. Each of the 4 proposals advocated for the return of housing to the city center and expansion of the souk areas. The BPPR proposal focused on the central business district, and their plan was the most detailed of the 4 proposals. The submittal included a multi-layered zoning plan and emphasized a new framework of pedestrian walkways, sheltered from the weather, running north-south between the Dow Harbor and the historic Safat Square. Next slide. That would connect the waterfront with the city center. In addition to conservation of the nearby Souk district, the 1973 final report indicated a dozen large multifunction car parks, or new souks, connected by an elevated monorail, linking pedestrian open spaces and a system of primary and secondary roads. Since 2004, rising land values have increased the demand for new, often isolated high-rise structures that entails the threat of a second erasure of urban fabric built during the latter half of the 20th century. The situation has spurred the architectural and preservation community to research the memory images of the city's pre-oil past before the 1950s modernization, and to draw attention to late 20th century structures now vulnerable due to physical deterioration or to the perception by some of the lack of cultural meaning. The BPPR plan provided guidance in 1974 for the Architects Collaborative, or TAC, the firm where the author served as lead design architect for Souk al-Wataniya, combining into one structure the modern car park with the ancient souk found in the Old Town and the traditional courtyard house type. The design explored how memory can play a part in urban design by forming a reinterpretation of history and by reintroducing traditional Arabic architectural features in contemporary design. Next slide. Fast forward 4 decades, how can this building type be repurposed to extend its useful life to accommodate the needs of the 21st century while preserving links to the past? Changes of use have already taken place at Souk al-Wataniya. Shortly after construction, many residences were repurposed into offices to obtain higher rents. However, the outward appearance remains a visual link with the setting of Kuwait's pre-oil years. The brief residential community, evoking an image of traditional Medina originally on the site before its wholesale demolition, was repurposed into a business incubator. Next slide. Around the time Candelas, Josic, and Woods presented their urban design proposal to the Advisory Planning Committee, Woods contributed an article to the Harvard Education Review entitled "The Education Bazaar" on the subject of architecture and education. As a longtime critic of isolating formal education from city life, Woods believed that the city itself is a school, college, and university, and to be relevant, education requires an urban context. Both the first master plan of 1951 and the BPPR 1969 proposal included the notion to bring an urban university into the center of the city. The BPPR study was based on a survey of historic Arab cities from Morocco, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, and examples of Western Old Town regenerations. The urban design recommendation was to include an urban university, much like Al-Azhar University in Cairo or Edinburgh University in Scotland. This exemplifies the current trend of Gulf cities in transforming from carbon-based economies to more sustainable, knowledge-intensive urban development. With the selection of the new Kuwait University Shaddadiya site outside the city center, planned to consolidate 7 scattered campuses for 30,000 commuter students by 2025, an in-city satellite branch presence would broaden the educational experience and revitalize the downtown area. Offering ample floor space, adequate parking, proximity to public transportation, and flexible commercial adjacencies, Souk al-Wataniya could be repurposed into a marketplace of ideas. The BPPR plan proposed a new building type for Kuwait City, one of compatible mixed uses of urban living, reminiscent of the holistic environment found in the early eras. Based on the courtyard residence of the Medina, Souk al-Wataniya also offered a memory image of the past during the mid to late 20th century golden era of prosperity and change. Through adaptive reuse, an urban campus for Kuwait University would provide a more diverse and vibrant inner city for Kuwait City's future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that was terrific. And as Sultan said, yeah, the photos are also incredible. Now I'd like to invite Jumanah to share a brief glimpse into her essay on Doha's waterfront. Jumanah.
Thank you, Huma. So I'd like to start my recap of the chapter with a small anecdote, which was one of the many conversations behind the development of Doha's Corniche and the institutional buildings along the waterfront. The anecdote is about two architects, Hisham Qudumi and William Pereira. The former was a key figure mediating between the state's vision to establish its physical infrastructure and the many architects whose practices were affiliated with modernism, while the latter was another enthusiastic architect eager to be part of the building of the image of a new nation. Both Qudumi and Pereira would take long walks along the Corniche and would discuss how to plan the waterfront border. They conversed about the genesis of the Corniche and its uses for the future, speculating on what type of public space would attract the citizens and residents of Qatar and what the private use of the reclaimed land would look like. In those conversations, Qudumi alluded to the body of the water as the generator and other institutional buildings as magnets. Next slide, please. So as you can see in this image, which was one of the many proposals envisioned for the Corniche, the Sheraton Hotel would be positioned at the end of the promenade and would be the central magnet. From there, the goal was to create a road linked to the movement of the city, of people, of goods, of cargo moving from and to the port, and of the circulation between different neighborhoods. Both architects agreed that the transformation of the waterfront was linked to the representation of the city as consisting of and functioning through the Corniche's network of circulating systems. Along this road would be, as you can see, the series of magnets that would form the mystery of the complex. So next slide, please. The development of the Corniche was isolated but crucially connected to the rest of the city. The Corniche became a site of experimentation and architectural invention, imagination, and representation for a nation. A reading of the dialogues behind the construction of the Corniche highlights the various mediums, figures, and conversations in mobilizing the waterfront development, but also in the process of reading the production and the mediation of the spatial articulation of the Corniche. The conclusion speculates on what is the future pathway of the Corniche. And to tie it back to the question of heritage, questions such as how is the past produced to preserve the city's future heritage became at the forefront of the chapter's conclusion. The Corniche presents itself with history, indeed a generator of historical narratives as Qudumi would have imagined. In this chapter, I speak of the Corniche as a place of layered historical imaginaries, a place of an idealized past and possible futures, because the reclamation project was at once nationalist and a futuristic endeavor, one that had constantly endured through the city's incongruous development. So the persistent survival of these buildings, or to put it in the terms of Qudumi, the survival of these magnets, they reflect the informal ways for keeping a certain visual language and preservation practice. However, the preservation of these buildings is not an embrace of modernity, as these modern buildings are neither a hindrance nor a catalyst. Rather, such practice are the outcome of the continuous use of the language of modernity to prove the state's legitimacy, often slipping between preserving iconic buildings and fostering a body of local knowledge and practices linked to memory and nostalgia. So overall, in foregrounding the historical context of the government's ways of executing and preserving projects, the present development of the Corniche is apparent. The Corniche is always constantly revisited and replanned by other architects, urban planners, and designers. But these magnets, they continue to linger on. They formed a spatial skeleton, and they formed a body that endured through time and into the future. These buildings, they are inscribed in a vehicle of political aspirations that mediates between a forged past and potential futures for the city's heritage. They captured the Corniche's form of future that the city would long live with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jumanah. Actually, when you were speaking just now, it reminded me of an interview that Todd Reese, who is also one of the contributors to the book, did with Dr. Makhlouf, one of the second urban planners for Abu Dhabi, in which Makhlouf narrates a story from the Quran when God punishes Qarun for his arrogance and having the earth swallow him up. And Makhlouf kind of uses this story from the Quran as an analogy for the task of the planner, saying that for the planner, the next building move is the equivalent of Karun swallowing earth. And so as you're kind of narrating the story of the many different iterations and replanning of the waterfront, and I think this comes out in the entire book in all the chapters. I'm just thinking about this constant way in which the earth is getting swallowed up and redesigned and reiterated. So thank you so much to Ed and Jumanah. I think it was really wonderful for us to start the launch, just getting right into the nitty-gritty texture and the beautiful archival photographs and plans and drawings that are prevalent throughout the book. And now that you have seen the micro, I think it's time to hand it over to Sultan Al-Qassemi and Roberto Fabbri to give you a macro level view of the book and have them explain to us why it's so important that they brought this book together in this particular moment. So over to you, Sultan and Roberto.
Thank you, Huma, so much. Roberto, if you allow me to begin, I also want to thank the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, Raymond Karam, Bushra Lawrence, and all their team who have been fantastic. This is our very first event to launch this book that we've been working on for 3 years. I dug up the original email that Roberto sent me on August 16, 2018. So this project has been in the works for three years and 2 or 3 months or so. And so it's been quite a time now. And it was really nice to hear Ed and Jumanah share their stories. This project is also thanks to the wonderful team at the Gulf Research Center, who hosted us for a roundtable in the summer of 2019 in Cambridge. We had 70 abstracts sent in, ideas for this call for papers that Roberto and I sent out. We had a task really to sift through these wonderful proposals. And we wanted to gain a balance between the gender, professions, and be as inclusive as possible. So that was quite a task, to be honest. And then finally, we used the occasion of the meeting in which about 24 participants or so gathered, and not only people who were involved in writing the book, but we had a lot of guest participants come in from the other conferences and the other seminars that were taking place. And even some students who were at Cambridge walk in and attend some of the events and then give us feedback. So not only were the contributors giving feedback to each other on the proposals and the abstracts, but we had an interesting group of people, political scientists. I remember walking in, attending certain seminars. And then finally, the pandemic struck in early 2020, and in a way that allowed Roberto and I really to spend so much time together online, sifting through the abstracts, editing and re-editing with the help of Iyad Husami, who was also a wonderful copy writer. And thanks to my colleague Todd Rees, who introduced us to Haller Brun, who are a Dutch design firm. I should say not a Dutch design firm, but the Dutch design firm, the very best. And they've been winning awards since 2018 or 19, every year, the best design firm. So you see the book, Huma, when you look at it, it is visually beautiful, even though they had to contend with so many restraints. We had a limited number of images. I believe it was 64 images or so. We could only publish in black and white. We could only publish, certain restraints that we had to contend with, but they did a wonderful job despite these constraints. And finally, I think the magic touch was Roberto Fabbri himself, who was very, very patient with me, and I'm so grateful to him and to all the other contributors. So you heard from Ed and Jumanah. I mean, how many people can say I was a lead architect in a project by TAC? This is a sentence that very few people can say, and also so humbly and with so much modesty that Ed Nilsson comes with, and also Jumanah with her wonderful in-depth research that she did to demystify the Doha Corniche, which I think is a metaphor for many other projects in the Gulf in which the local architect has been overlooked. So again, between the emir, between the ultimate boss or the sovereign, and between the architect, there was always this person who would bring these two sides together. And I think Jumanah's essay is a template for so many other people to research who are the overlooked figures in our modern history when it comes to urbanism. So I want to say that Jumanah and Ed are just two of the many contributors that we have whose papers are equally fascinating. And I hand over now to Roberto.
Thank you, Sultan. Thank you for the nice word. It's always difficult to speak after Sultan. I'll try to do my best. I'd like to start where Sultan left by describing the system in place while we were doing the book. And it's always problematic doing a book. Doing an edited collection of text is normally a big headache. This time it wasn't. It was an idyllic collaboration, and I'm still surprised that this happened in this way. Everyone contributed to their best, and I'm not saying that because, I mean, the book speaks for itself. It was a collaboration from day one. Sultan and I have our names bigger in the list, but it was really a team effort. And from the moment in which we had the call for paper out, we collect the essays. We had to leave many good proposals out, and then we met in Cambridge. We started working together, and our introduction to the book is basically a series of content that we kind of borrowed from the contributor that we selected. Before going into the discussion, I have I wrote down a few notes about the motivation behind the book, of what were the themes that also Huma started introducing before the presentation of our contributor, and the structure of the book. I think it's important to just point out a few of these points before opening the floor for more discussions. So the book is composed by 13 chapters, plus the introduction and the conclusions and the nice preface by Professor Kishwar Rizvi. And these 13 chapters, in their own way, in their respective arguments, gravitate around two temporal points of interest in the book timeline, which is modernity and contemporaneity, which is duality that is also reflected in the book title. So the book interprets modernity as the age of modernization in terms of the urban transformation that changed this city after the oil discovery until the mid-80s, and it does so as a display of transnational architectural practices that at that time redefined concepts like locality, authenticity, and global aspiration, for example. But the book doesn't want to do a retrospective. The aim we had was to reflect also on the current status of the Gulf cities. So to retrace the protagonist of the modernist project and see what was the current situation of these objects. And I use the word object because most of the time these buildings now are isolated or are scattered. They are no longer part of a vision, of a common vision. No? We use in introduction the term of city within a bigger city, because it was a city envisioned at that time, but it was then absorbed, changed, demolished, reimagined as with the layer of the contemporary city. So the survivals that Jumanah pointed out, the survivals were the interest of the book, and in particular in terms that this survival in the meanwhile lost their function, their main function, and their original meanings. So one of the aim of the book is to see these obsolete objects in terms of opportunities. And as, for example, Ed explained in the last part of his presentation, there's opportunities in this building to consolidate the Gulf contemporary city that is facing new challenges, like the consumption of land, for example, and the reconsolidation of existing project could, for example, tackle this problem. This is one of the subjects that we touch base with, including the notion of heritage that I'm assuming we can hear more during the Q&A. So without further ado, Huma, I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Roberto, and thank you, Sultan, for just giving us a brief glimpse into all of the work and thoughtfulness that has gone into even developing the structure of the book, assembling the team of contributors. And I know any book project like this takes so many years, so much time, and so many people who remain unnamed and hidden in the footnotes sometimes to help us try to understand this topic. I wanted to ask all of you a quick question just to start our Q&A off. And while I'm asking this, I encourage everyone who's attending, please use the Q&A function and ask questions. The panelists are eager to respond, so please don't be shy. But one of the questions that I had, actually, it reminded me of something that Sooud Hassan had written in her essay for the book, which is called An Absent Space, 1355. And in it, Sooud talks about actually what the role of oral history is in reconstructing these earlier histories. So I think that sometimes when we're sitting in the Western academe, we presume that there is a proliferation of archives and papers and documentation. It's very easy to assemble. But actually, most of the contributors who are working in this book had to adapt a lot of really novel research methodologies in order to reconstruct what are rather imperfect and incomplete histories, and also relying on oral history. So, which is why, of course, having Ed with us is really important, because Ed can tell us, anecdotally about things that we would never be able to find in an archive or even in personal papers and collections. So what I'd like to ask all of you, and perhaps we can start with Ed, and then with Jumanah, and then with Sultan and Roberto. Can you talk to us about some of your struggle? Even though you were there, Ed, sometimes architects and planners don't always keep archives of their work, and they themselves struggle to reconstruct their own histories of work. So, yeah, can you tell us more about your process?
Yeah, we started working on these projects in December of 1973, and this was a time when work in the United States was falling off and the Middle Eastern work was sort of blossoming, and the desire to get these projects up and out and built in a very short time was one of the main challenges. Having just graduated a few years earlier from graduate school, these projects were basically car parks, and I think at that time there wasn't much interest in the car parks, and that's why they probably gave it to younger, less experienced architects in the office to proceed. But looking at the program, we carefully discovered that there were other incentives for the builders to actually build it by receiving the rents from the housing or from the shops. But there came an opportunity to really make this building more than just a car park. So in a sense, our task was to disguise or minimize the impact of the car park, which usually doesn't add very much to the streetscape in the city. The pace was very fast. The conditions on site were very somewhat simple. We didn't have good, accurate survey drawings to know what the limits of the site were. So we actually had to expand the building at one point, let's say 5 meters. And since the the government owned all the land, it didn't seem to make much difference. So there was a kind of a rough and ready context of getting the job done and meeting the deadlines. Of course, the building was unusual, so that we actually had to wait a year or two before a contractor would come along and provide a competitive bid and be willing to build it. And so that took 2 years, I think, and it was finally a Korean contractor, Hanyang Construction, was the selected one. So it was very fast-paced. It took a lot of people. There were about 15 architects and draftsmen working on the project at the peak. It's probably a very unique set of circumstances that came together all at once.
Thank you, Ed. Jumanah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I do. I think in the process of collecting and gathering the research for the paper, I've come to realization that it's best not to fall back into these institutional archives and that is, state-led, but rather also look into the personal archives that tend to have, such as the case of Hisham Qaddoumi's archive that had a lot of these project briefs, these design proposals, these sketches that, them themselves have a great value of information and knowledge to be transmitted down. So it wasn't just the words of one architect such as Hisham Qaddoumi, but rather what he has gathered over the years in terms of those small notes and those design invitations. So I think, the history of, in the process of writing one potential history of the Corniche that came through, like the emphasis on the mediums came through. So as opposed to just, the institutional ones or oral knowledge or, so forth.
Huma, may I also add something here briefly?
Absolutely.
The idea that there are archives in the West that are accessible and easy to use and approach is the figment of imagination. I can tell you that for this book specifically, we contacted a number of archives, and some of them were uncooperative, some of them were unreachable, some of them didn't have the images. For instance, one of the beautiful pictures in Jumanah Abbas's essay came from I think Fatima Sahlawi, I believe, or Atlas in Doha. And then Roberto and I attempted to reach out to the archive of William Pereira. I think they were going through some maintenance, so it just wasn't reachable. And finally, we went and we contacted the family and the relatives of William Pereira on Facebook. We found somebody who lived in somewhere in Nevada, I think, and then we found his number through some other website. And finally, we sent him an SMS on Apple. I used my Apple phone for the first time in 5 years because that's the only way to get through to him, an iMessage. And then he granted us permission for that one image, which he didn't even have. And so the idea that, in the West, you have access to images, and in the East, the images are more difficult. In fact, I think it's a bit of both in both worlds. Sometimes we have images, we don't have permissions, and sometimes they don't even have the images on the other side, at least in North America and the West.
Yeah, very true. If I can add a little on what Sultan is saying. I recall that also Ed struggled to get the drawings of the building that his own design, because when TAC went bankrupt, I think that the majority of the office properties were sold or dispersed. So if I don't recall wrongly, right, Ed?
Yes, well, I actually made a point of making copies of the drawings, which I had in my personal collection, but surprisingly, very little of this project made it to the MIT storage site for some reason. It just must have gotten lost in the shuffle, but it was very surprising how little information was available other than my personal collection.
Thank you all. That was a really nice rumination on this question of archives. And you're absolutely right, Sultan and Roberto, that the assumption that archives proliferate or are accessible in one part of the world and not in other is actually incorrect. We have a number of questions now from the audience. I'm going to kind of combine 3 questions into one, I think, because they're speaking on similar themes. So there's a question from Banu Denise Agdenisli, and Sef Al-Mutawa, and another question from Scott Wiener. And I think all of these questions are kind of trying to get at this question of authenticity. So what is, a Khaliji form of heritage, right? What is the interplay between architecture, national identity, and nation building? Scott mentions in Oman how Sultan Qaboos modernized urban spaces that in a way that rejected Western styles. Does this have relevance to other countries in the Gulf? Sef Al-Mutawa talks about how Sultan, you had mentioned in an earlier talk that this idea of authenticity and with regards to culture is central to heritage, but there's also a lot of talk of the so-called Disneyland effect in Gulf cities and, the effect that has on visitors' imagination of what Gulf cities are. So I just wonder if you could address these questions of heritage that a number of the attendees have.
I would probably like to begin by just saying that the Sukat al-Wataniya is essentially a reconstruction of an absent thing. It tends to recreate the image of what used to be on that site. But more importantly, the purpose is also to revitalize the inner city of Kuwait. As you saw from the aerial photograph in 2016, much of the inner city has vacant, empty lots, and there's a lack of housing in the downtown Kuwait. So that the purpose of this was to reestablish a model of bringing housing back into the city to revitalize it. And even though the building is a reconstruction, not an accurate reconstruction, but a symbolic reconstruction of the housing that used to be on the site with its mixed use activities. That's the goal that it tries to promulgate in the future, that bringing more housing back to the city in a similar way with so many other car parks. Unfortunately, Al-Wataniya is the only one that has housing, but it doesn't prevent the others from being adaptively reused into housing.
Sultan, is there anything you'd like to add? I think they mentioned your talk specifically.
No, I think I'll defer to somebody else. I feel like I spoke too much.
I'll jump in then, Sultan. I'm kind of curious about the question that Scott proposed, and this is $1 million question, and it's always difficult to define Western or Eastern styles, and I'm kind of worried about the implication of any definition of that, but I will probably say that, for example, Ed and I are expression of Western architecture, but the culture we represent are completely different. We grew up in different architectural cultures. So in the moment in which an American architect or an Italian architect are invited to work outside in the known West, it's not like one recipe that can be overlapped. And when the Abu Dhabi plan was given to a Japanese architect, that's even a further layer in that. So it's like, it's difficult for me to define why rejecting Western style in total. What is Western style? What is an Eastern style? Especially when we talk about Kuwait, where the entire city was erased from the face of the earth, except from the mosques. But so I don't know, kind of like maybe sending this question to my panelists and see if they have something to add.
I think I'll echo some of what you said. I remember in the process of writing it, I would always use that particular language where I would say the Western style, and you would keep pushing me to question what is the Western style. And I think there is no a set of definitions that define what a Western style is, or emphasizing on this exchange between the East and the West, but rather look into how, the countries of the Gulf attempted to adapt the language of modernity in order to preserve and, heighten its status as a state, as an independent nation state. And, in the process of adapting, it just keeps on, using that particular language to keep a certain heritage. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I just wanted to echo with what Roberto said.
I wanted to move us to a next question. I think so far we've been talking a lot about the questions of heritage in the past, but what about the question of the future? So Kristen Diwan writes, we are hearing a lot this week about net zero or green initiatives in the Gulf states. Could you speak further about how repurposing these modern structures can work within these decarbonization ambitions?
I would add that since the greenest building is an existing building, just the act of preserving and readapting an existing building to new use, I think is what we need more of. The three elements for the revitalization of Kuwait, I think, involves adaptive reuse and historic preservation. And there needs to be an education that will bring awareness of how we can comply with sustainable standards and preserve our heritage at the same time. The technology that was attractive to the Souk al-Wataniya mostly had to do with mechanical systems and structural engineering. So little of that, I think, is repurposed by now, but certainly, new mechanical systems can reduce the environmental load on the building. Certainly, solar panels would fit many of the sloped roofs, for example. I don't know if that answered the question, but.
Maybe I can say something briefly. I feel like these initiatives should be commended, whether it's in Saudi or the UAE or elsewhere. I think the Gulf states have their own characteristics, whether it is the weather, the environment, the sand challenges, desertification, the desalination. So I think we need to be at the forefront of these challenges. We shouldn't just wait for technology to be transferred to us from the West or the East. And I see that there are now new initiatives that the Gulf states have launched. I just hope that they're not just, how do they say, just news bubbles just to attract attention. And I hope we see them reflected across different industries and not just not just the Ministry of Environmental Affairs or whatever they call it in the Gulf. But I think this is something that goes into the industry, into infrastructure, even into investment. Are we investing in green energies? And I think we need this more than any other region of the world.
I think as a follow-up to that question is something that Diana wrote in the chat, which is going through the book, what are the things or lessons you learned and what are the advices that you would give to those who are in charge of urban planning in a city? So I think the question points to, well, what are the policy implications for these questions of heritage, right? Because we are talking about urban space. Ed, of course, talked about housing regeneration as part of the redevelopment of a historic core. But what does it really mean? What's the then what question for us?
I thought it was interesting that these nearly dozen car parks were essentially built by developers. There was an urban plan to provide parking, essentially to get the cars off the streets. But as an incentive, the developers were given an opportunity to take the rents from the shops and from the housing and so forth. So this partnership between government and private development, I think, is one tool that helps keep this idea of viable and makes these projects possible. I don't know how else it would have been. I just regret that this concept is not used more in the States, where municipal private joint ventures can really achieve much more than one or the other, I think.
Jumanah, would you like to add anything to that? What would you like to see done in Doha, for instance?
I think I want to think about it. So I think I'll pass the mic to someone else while I think about the question.
Roberto, Sultan, would you like to add anything?
You mean regarding the policies, Huma?
Yeah, I mean, there was a question about, well, what should the people who are in charge of urban planning do based on the lessons that you've learned in this book?
Sultan raises his hand, so please go for it.
I feel like playing the role of optimist here, but I see so many positive developments in the region. I serve on a committee in the UAE to protect modern buildings. I think the results will be published later in 2022. There's so much going on in the Gulf. I'm so I mean, I feel optimistic. In Saudi, we see Dubai announcing laws. The UAE federally is going to announce things next year. Kuwait has also, we see actually a grassroots movement in Kuwait, which is unlike some other states in the Gulf. We see a recognition of modern architecture. And as you said at the opening, Huma, that whether it is restoring them to their past glory or sprucing them up and adding an additional annex, this is a question that isn't just unique to the Gulf, but we see it across the world. But I think the most important thing is how to make the building livable, viable, a building habitable, a building that is in use, people go and visit, and rather being an architectural relic of the past that people pass in front of and never enter. How can you make this building like the Cultural Foundation in Abu Dhabi, for example, like the Sharjah's flying saucer, these buildings that are repurposed, the buildings that are reused and brought back into the community, I think is more important than anything else, and not just a government building that few people have access to. So there's so many positive developments happening, and I think this book, amongst many others, because there is a trend now that I think this book is part of, in which we acknowledge these modern, recent past buildings and their role.
I think on the trend of optimism that Sultan has started here, there's a question from Martin Nixon, which says, what buildings or architectural projects in the Gulf do you find inspiring or which could point to the future? So is there a particular project, Jumanah, Ed, Roberto, Sultan, that you think has really inspired you historically, in the present moment, or is being planned right now?
I think one of those buildings that tends to go, overlooked or unnoticed is the Gulf Cinema in Doha. And it's particularly inspiring because throughout its, the history of its use, despite that it's being shut down right now, is that it was a cinema not only for, certain nationalities, but it was a cinema for all kinds of nationalities. Even the content, the movies that were being distributed and circulated around were very much targeted for the migrant communities. So this particular cinema, I find it, how it's lived throughout and how the people lived with it as well is particularly inspiring. And I do hope in the future that it does linger on and it does open up its doors, but open up its doors to the same kind of community that it once invited.
Well, if you referring to the modernist time, there's plenty of interesting building that could be a lesson for today's new proposal, especially because the materiality was, it was not an idea of, just air conditioning and glazing tower, but there was a discussion on the facade and how the facade could become some sort of a second, third layer to filter the harsh weather in. So there's plenty of buildings that could be studied in the schools of architecture, in the local school of architecture, but even abroad. But if I have to pick one, I mean, I should pick Ed's building because, of course, it's definitely one, and I'm serious. It's definitely a good example and a good case studies. Contemporary buildings, it's more difficult to me to pick and choose. It's most of them I still have to digest what is being built here. Well, there are some like the Louvre Abu Dhabi, for example, is unquestionable a good building, and not for the rain of light has been defined, also the light that is coming through the roof, but more for how the Islamic city is being reinterpreted underneath the cap. So these typological reflection are more interesting to me than the spectacular dome that is called.
I would just add that I think one of my favorite projects in the inner city of Kuwait is also the Old Souk, the restoration of the Old Souk. I was very surprised when I saw that it showed that there was a real love of the spirit of the Old Souk district, and very delicately modernizing it and building on that. If the site plan of all of the souks, the core of that site plan was the Old Souk district, and that became sort of the hub of that whole central business district. So I thought that was very admirable as a way of restoring the heritage and bringing it up to speed and contemporary values.
Wonderful. I think this is a good note to end on. The buildings that inspire us and that constitute the stories and the essays and the sort of memories that are kind of littered throughout the book. I know that there were many more questions. I encourage all the attendees to reach out to panelists, to reach out to AGSIW, and let us know if you want to continue the conversation elsewhere. But at this point, I just want to thank Raymond. I want to thank the Gulf States Institute and for welcoming us, for giving us a space to celebrate the launch of this book. And I'll pass it on to Raymond.
Thank you so much, Huma, and thank you to Sultan, to Roberto, to Ed, to Jumanah for joining this great discussion today and letting us host the launch of this exciting book. We're so glad that we're able to contribute to this conversation. It's a conversation that we've been having since, honestly, the inception of the Institute. We've hosted talks. For example, I think Ed mentioned Farah al-Naqib. We've hosted her, and I encourage you to go back to our website and check and check the recordings of her lectures. My colleague Kristen Diwan just reminded me also that we've just hosted on our website a piece by one of our research associates, Nada Magi, on a initiative called In Narrative that explores kind of urban Gulf spaces and gives a platform to architects and designers and the public to speak about the environment that they live in through storytelling. So again, we're excited that we're able to host this. Continue the conversation with us. Please check our website, agsiw.org, sign up to our newsletter, and we look forward to seeing you all in the near future.